Dear Tobias, thank you so much for your time and availability to meet and talk with me. I would like to learn more about your Masonic journey before we go further into the conversation, and allow me to start from the beginning. Did you find Freemasonry, or did Freemasonry find you?
I found that no, that I can't answer that little question. That's not how I think about it at all.
Okay.
I was simply aware of Freemasonry from the earliest years. My grandfather was a Freemason, and I used to see his regalia in his surgery where he worked, and I was always fascinated by it. And I think my mother had said that the Freemasons know something. They have an insight into a mystery of life. And you'd hear little hints of this, that there was some sort of great secret that Masons knew. So I grew up with that, thought about it. My parents used to go to ladies' evenings events. My dad always spoke very well of Masons, but he was never involved with it.
Ah.
He thought about it. I think he thought, my dad was very much an individualist. He didn't really want to become part of a fraternity, but he always said to me that their principles were excellent. And, there was no reason to think anything but good about Freemasonry, even though he'd read some of the things that my grandfather had shown him. So it sort of came like that. I was aware of Masonry again when I was reading books, when I was at university studying religion. I was aware of a link between magic and Esoterica and Masonry. And I got interested in Aleister Crowley when I was at college, and his books were full of grandiose titles. And there was a sort of Masonic feeling to his book, even though he wasn't a member of an English lodge. He joined Freemasonry in France in a lodge affiliated to the National French Grand Lodge, not the Grand Orient.
Yeah.
The other one, which at the time he joined, England didn't recognise. But a year later, after he joined, just after he left it because they made a link with the Co-Masons. Yeah. He left the French regular Grand Lodge of France, I think it was called, or Loge Nationale Française. He left that because they were prepared to tolerate the Co-Masons of Annie Besant. Anyway, so he couldn't affiliate with English Masonry. But his book was full of all of this. I thought the Masonic side seemed rather silly. And my feeling about it was a sort of boys' club. I was going to train to be a priest in Sweden when I was 29, 30.
Really?
I learned Swedish. I'd been working in television for nearly 10 years then, and I always felt television was a holding operation for something more important of a spiritual kind. And I had a vocation, and I was taken under the wing of the Bishop of Växjö in Sweden. Yeah. And he wanted me to go over there and train and be his what do you call it, examining chaplain, I suppose. So I had a position to go to in Uppsala, and I was going to study Lutheran theology for a year. This was back in 91, I think. And I got to the airport. I'd been studying Elias Ashmole in detail for my esoteric books. And because Ashmole came from Lichfield, which is where I'd been living a long time.
Yeah.
And I loved Ashmole, and I realized that he had the key to the future of Freemasonry. And it turned out my friend in Sweden, the bishop, was also a Mason.
Really?
And he was a Gnostic, and he was going to publish my book on the Gnostics in Swedish.
Wow.
I got to the airport, about to take the plane to Göteborg, Gothenburg as we call it. I had sensation that I must not do it. And I went back to Lichfield, and I buried myself studying Elias Ashmore.
Wow.
And then I could see that Lichfield could become a centre of the true Masonic spirit, which I could perceive in Ashmore. 17th century Masonry interested me. I got in touch with my friend Christopher McIntosh, who'd often talked about Masonry. He's a Masonic historian and written some very good books on the Rosicrucians and other mystical and magical subjects, and a fine scholar. He has a doctorate from Oxford, and I got to know him when he was doing his doctorate for a film for Amsterdam Utrecht television.
I saw it that you were, yeah.
And I interviewed him for that. And he said, well, why don't you join my lodge? And he was a member of the Pilgrim Lodge, which is a German-speaking lodge in London. He said, the best way to know Masonry, Toby, is from the inside. I said, well, okay, let's do that. And I had this plan for a Masonic museum in Lichfield, and I started to get enthusiastic about Masonry as being an institution which had no vision of how to realize itself in the modern world, the English Masonry particularly. Yeah. And I could see how it could be done. And so I didn't join the German lodge because I didn't fancy listening to German that much. Even though I had a lot of German friends, my German, it was too much effort, listening to German. It was an interesting lodge, though, because it was where the founders of the Order of the Golden Dawn came from. It was Theodore Royce was a member of Pilgrim Lodge, and that was his access to MacGregor Mathers, Samuel Mathers, properly called. So, I got in on it through this esoteric thing, and then I got to know the Marquis of Northampton, who at the time was Assistant Grand Master. And I shared a bit of my vision with him, and he was very, very positive about it and encouraging. And we sort of had some interesting plans and ideas to develop the educational side of Masonry. And we were going great guns with that. And we launched the magazine, Freemasonry Today, and I was the founder editor. And so that was. I can't tell you whether I found Masonry or Masonry found me. We met anyway. But it was like meeting an old friend. I'd always felt a certain affinity with the strange atmospheres that you find in Masonry. I think for me the great thing about it was to meet people like yourself from other countries who shared often more richly the philosophical ideals of Masonry. English Masonry is not very philosophical. I often think that English Masonry should be unique because I think they should only let women into British Masonry because English women are far more receptive and accommodating of the subtleties of allegory and imaginative thinking that is essential to Masonry. And English men in general just simply can't see this dimension of life because they've been brought up to be suspicious of philosophy. Wow. England has this whole thing about common sense, practicality, all of those high virtues, which I think have kept us from going mad until recently, anyway. But I think Masonry is a subtle and suggestive symbolic science, and it requires the kind of mind that the British male cannot accommodate. That is why I believe one of the problems of Masonry has been a lot of people joined it from the armed forces after the war, and their idea of a square is something you march round in a unit. So being on the square, I think, seems to them to suggest discipline. Yeah. In a sort of military sense. It's uprightness, but they forget it's not about building a uniformity. A harmony is not a uniformity. The army requires a uniformity, or historically it did. Square bashing, as my father, who was in the army, used to call it, square bashing was marching round the square. And I think a lot of the English attitude towards Masonic discipline is based on military experience. And that's why a lot of military people find it very pleasant. It's another way of being on parade.
Thank you, Tobias. Now the question, are you still member of a Blue Lodge or the Craft, active member? And are you part of any of the higher degrees, Royal Arch, Mark, Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite?
Well, am I a member? Yes, insofar as I once a Mason. Do I actively participate in group meetings in this country? No. But if somebody asks me to, like you've asked me, to speak about it, whether that's in Vancouver, Washington, or Hamburg, or wherever it might be, Vienna, I'm happy to speak about the Masonry that I believe in, but it's not for me. I can only speak for myself. I've never needed this kind of personal affiliation with a group.
Yeah.
I'm perfectly happy dealing with individuals. There are all different aspects to the spiritual body. You know, there are parts of the body which need to work very closely with other parts of the body, and there are parts of the body which take a different view and operate not entirely. No man is an island, as our brother John Donne said all those years ago. But my role is to be of use if you want me.
Understood.
That's what it is. If I hear the call, I will
answer it.
Do what I can. But I honestly don't get anything out of sitting around and trying to remember when to stand up, sit down. I've always found the business of handshakes, symbol signs. I even think the Hiram Abiff story is really such a late invention, 1730 perhaps.
Yeah, in that time, yeah, around that time frame, between 1723 and 38, right?
My Masonry really goes back well before. The Masonry I've discovered was trying to piece the fragments, and it's very difficult, of before the Grand Lodge Whig system, London, came in. I take a dim view of what went on in the 1720s under the Duke of Montagu.
Yeah,
I take a dim view of it because I think there was a lot of lies were communicated about the history of the craft, but I am totally aware that if they hadn't created this new thing, this Grand Lodge system, we wouldn't be sitting here having this discussion now.
Yeah.
Because there have always been sodalities of concerned men and women who wanted to do spiritual work, who were not priests or who were not church people. They used to call them confraternities in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
And I personally believe that the lay, as we call it in England, the lay witness to Christ and to God is probably more important than the services of the church. These are very complex questions. And what was the original question you were asking?
If you are still active Mason and if you were part of any...
Mason, because I'm building the temple.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, very clear.
Yeah, I feel I'm more active with the work I do than if I was content with a meeting, because I'm trying to communicate essence.
Yeah. Tobias, looking at your biography, I truly have to recognize you have had a fascinating life journey, notwithstanding a remarkable talent. Musician, composer, filmmaker, author, and the list goes on. Now, it seems that across time you have explored, across multiple means, a way to express your talent, but also to bring forward the history and the knowledge that you're talking about. currently, in your life journey, seems like you settle on the writing aspect. How do you look back at your life journey and see the red line, and why have you chosen the writing as your current way of expressing yourself?
I've always been writing, and it was so normal for me to write, and so natural for me to express myself in writing, in poetry. When I was writing poetry and stories I was doing since I've been a child, that I didn't think it was a career. It was just something I did, and I always thought I'd be a writer on the side, as it were. That there'd always be this writing thing going, but my real interest was filmmaking and television and music, and it just happened that a set of circumstances at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, destroyed the television road. The 1990 Broadcasting Act of Margaret Thatcher removed the requirement of independent TV companies in England to make religious programs. Oh. That was a terrible blow for me, because then the only outlet for religious programs was the BBC. Now, I'd worked for the BBC in their flagship religious documentary series, Everyman, but working for the BBC was one thing. If you worked for Channel 4, it was another. Channel 4 at that time was a really seriously creative environment, a bit like going to Apple under the Beatles regime. There was an idealism and a freedom that perhaps people didn't even realise how unusual it was. It was unique. So I got used to that. I've been associated with Channel 4 for 10 years. And suddenly to find that Channel 4 didn't have to make religious programs, that was a real blow. So it was, there was that going on, but also I was feeling pulled away anyway for a more spiritual vocation. My attitude towards TV was, well, if I don't do something, the devil will have all of it. So if I can put one little program, at least I've done my bit, like putting something in lest the dam break. I put a brick in there that made me. Of course, now there is no spiritual television whatsoever. There's no vision in the telly. And I spent a long time then also trying to make movies, Hollywood and all this. And there's no better way for a man to lose his shirt than to engage on trying to make films.
True.
Unless you're Louis B. Mayer's brother-in-law. It's a closed shop. It really is. And people who become famous in the current fashion get into these things. But they always produce totally forgettable work. I mean, there's always the odd person who just gets incredibly lucky.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, it's very difficult. So I got more involved with the writing, and I kept my music up. And it was just trying to survive, really. Trying to survive. It was the 90s for me were the worst period since my father used to talk about the depression in the 30s.
Yeah.
Well, I was depressed. My mother thought I would kill myself. She really was worried about me because I was so desperate. They were trying to take my flat away. I was literally, I had no money. I don't know. Even now, I wonder how I survived. It was an awful, awful time, and it left a lot of scars. So I didn't necessarily choose to, I decided to concentrate on writing. It was, well, what else can I do?
Yeah.
It turned out that writing really was a way that I could be, there was a road that I could walk down. I wanted to be a priest, but something always stopped it. It's very strange. I still feel like a priest in the same way as I feel like I'm a Mason. I still feel I'm involved in some kind of Eucharist of life.
Yeah.
That I'm trying to share the spirit of truth, and to try and live it and live with it. And writing is what William Blake said: poetry, painting, and music, the three powers for conversing with paradise, which the flood did not sweep away. And by the flood, he meant the flood of time and space.
Yeah.
So poetry, painting, music. Well, that's what I do. You know, I don't write a lot of poems, but I think poetry imbues my sensibility in my writing. At the moment, I'm back into the idea of writing for films again.
Oh.
But not documentaries really this time. I'm more interested in drama. So I've been writing drama scripts. You know, I'm still most of my friends who I was at Oxford with have had their careers, are thinking whether they should retire. And I say, I'm still looking for my career. I really do. One of these days, you know, I'm going to have a career.
Yeah. Well, that keeps a young mindset as well, huh? I have to say.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
But I think the brethren, the true brethren, have always got a young mindset. You know, the body grows old around us to our shock and horror, but we don't grow old with it.
I totally agree.
You know, Christ is still a baby as far as I'm concerned.
Can I react 1 second to this? But do you see, or do you foresee, or is there a willingness from your side to actually pursue this priest career as well? Do you see the call?
Probably less so. Now, I'm probably more realistic about the limitations of the human animal. When I was younger, I was only aware of the unlimited nature of human beings. I was interested in the infinite and the eternal, and I could see the seeds of that in man. I've had enough experience many times over now to realize that while man does have a ladder to the stars, he much prefers his leaden boots either to walk in or to kick somebody's teeth in with them. And you know, I certainly don't idealize the church or any church anymore. Paracelsus used to talk about the church of stone, and he praised the invisible church, and that's the invisible church is the one I'm working with.
You're looking at.
Having said that, we invisibles are also looking for a manifestation of this church in real life. Now, how does it manifest? Does it manifest by putting up a building and saying we are the temple of the Almighty, whatever? You know, does it manifest by saying I'm going to fight for God and destroy everything that I think He doesn't like, or something like this? No, I think it manifests in the vision you have of life and your perceptions that you have, and you hope, obviously, you hope to touch people and. You know, play your part. What our part is, I don't know. I think we're sort of icebergs, really. Most of our work, we don't even know what we're doing.
Yeah.
It's almost like God would say to us, you know, if I told you what you were here for, you wouldn't like it.
That's a good one. I would leave a lot of people scratching their heads, and now what?
Well, if I told you what you were here for, you might die of shock. It's not always. I had a lovely friend once, very wise old bird, as an architect, and he used to say, "Toby, if we were meant to know, we would be told." So I don't have a grand plan. I'm very interested in any kind of new idea or anything that's truly creative and has an energy behind it that's pure or almost pure, and certainly of pure intent.
If you look back at the beginning, when you started writing, when you started exploring the necessity of collecting history, writing about history, or writing a novel, or even looking into the religious aspect, who did influence you at the beginning? Was it your father, like you were mentioning earlier? Or was there another character or event that triggered that eagerness of yours?
Well, I think partly it was the times. I was emerging into consciousness in the 1960s, and I had a privileged seat in a way, because my family were very dynamic at the time. My father had I mentioned my father, obviously a big influence. Dad was a person who couldn't settle within existing frameworks. He was always looking for an ideal. And so we went to Australia when I was 6. And I think that had a big impact. I saw the world at a very early age. I'd been around the world before I was 8.
Wow.
And I took it in. I'm very open-minded. A lot of big influences. I was also born deaf. I couldn't hear until I was 3.
Really?
It was some sort of birth defect that suddenly changed when I was 3. And I used to have a hearing aid the size of a tuba, like a big Bakelite thing.
Wow.
They used to have in the 60s. And it was massive. And the first things I could hear were like this.
Oh la la.
Talk to speak. I had a speech therapist. They didn't know whether I was stupid or not, whether I had no brains, because I couldn't understand what was being said to me. So there was no way of knowing until you can speak what kind of intelligence you've got. So I had a speech therapist who taught me to speak, which I'm very glad about. And so I learned, I think that was a big influence also, that I was aware of communication as a thing itself, not just automatic. I was aware that I was in a world of communication.
Yeah.
And the moment I could speak, of course, you couldn't shut me up. I want still to say, I wanted to talk about everything.
Wow.
And be aware of everything. And I had a vision of God explicitly when I was 5 years old. You'd call it a satori, if you're a Zen person. I had that experience, and I was aware of a multidimensional universe of which I was a part. So I didn't get any of that from books at all, or from any teacher. That was coming to me. Then, and I always get bored very easily, so I will read a book if it's interesting and if it leads me to another and so on. My father started collecting books seriously when I was 10 or 11, and he used to come home. He'd work all week in a factory, and on a Friday night he got paid. And he'd come back, he'd go to an antiquarian bookshop on his way home, and he'd come back with a pile of books like this. He'd sit in his chair, and he would sit for the weekend
going through the books,
just with the book, reading. And I liked it and I hated it at the same time, because he tended to read out loud, Listen to this, listen to this. He was so excited about what he was reading. So I took he started giving me books, so I started to build up a library. And I always loved history. We had one teacher at school, an RE teacher called Trevor Harding, who was a wonderful man who worked in the 1930s in Cardiff, taking the sailors off the ships through the red light district so they could give their money to their wives and not to the prostitutes. Yeah, and he was a very inspiring man, and he had a bigger vision of Christianity than is normal as well. He was an influence insofar as he encouraged me to go back. I was going to leave school when I was 15 and be an apprentice bookbinder at the British Museum. I passed an exam. I took an exam. 250 people took the exam. I got one of 2 apprenticeships as a bookbinder and manuscript restorer. And I was going to leave home in the Midlands and have to live with the secretary of the bindery in Wembley. Yeah. And I was how old was I? 15 when this was going on. So I was going to be sold to the apprenticeship.
Yeah.
The first man I'd met at the British Museum was a lovely man, Mr. Turner, and he loved books, you could tell. And he retired. And just before I was supposed to start, the new guy came, and he was a gruff, cold-hearted figure. And the voice said in me when I saw him for the last time, my parents came down to present me to him because you're an apprentice.
Yeah.
And I looked at him and I said, no, I'm not going on this direction. I read an account of William Blake, who had the same experience.
Yeah.
Of his father trying to put him with somebody for an apprenticeship, and Blake said to his father, that man will be hanged. And he knew, and I knew, and I had a terrible time with my father, because Dad thought, well, yes, but if you're an apprentice, you'll become a bookbinder, you'll have a job for life, and you can do all your own studying in your own time. But I knew something that wasn't going to be it. It wouldn't work for me like this. To be owned for 5 years or whatever the apprenticeship was, I wasn't going to have that.
Wow.
My mother, who is the biggest influence on my life, she wrote to Oxford, and Dad had been doing a lot of research on the family and found that our ancestors had a big part to play in Oxford in the church, in the Oxford movement. And she wrote, not my dad, she wrote to Brasenose College and said, what chance has my son, he goes to a comprehensive school, etc. He's only just done his O-levels. And they wrote back and said, well, he's as much chance as anybody. If he gets his exams, he does his A-levels, he doesn't even have, all he has to do is pass the entrance exam. In those days, you could Oxford without A-levels at all.